Welcome to part two of an awesome conversation with Debbie Brosnan from The Effortless Kitchen. If you didn't catch the first part of our conversation, it is live in the main Parent Tween Connection Facebook group, as well as out on our YouTube channel and on LinkedIn. And we talked about some things that, Debbie, you were like, well, maybe these are obvious, but maybe they're not. And I think for more of us, they fall into the maybe not category. but for those of you just tuning in or just listening, Debbie gave us some really easy tips on, well, some fantastic tips on how to make healthy cooking easy. Which for, you mentioned you've cooked for 5 for a very long time because you raised 3 kids yourself, Debbie. And you're like, yeah, it can be arduous. It can be such a chore. It can be exhausting, never mind expensive, especially if things get thrown away or wasted. So I love the way that you were talking about kind of like a middle ground of meal prepping, not really meal prepping, but a little bit of food prepping and how to utilize food in different ways. So if for folks tuning in, if you haven't checked that out, definitely check it out. But this is where I feel like things get even juicier because we're talking now about how to help you get your kids into the kitchen with you, why that's so important and what that does for your relationship and for the connection that you have with your kiddos. So Debbie, where do we even start? How do we get them in?
Okay, so this is really interesting. With my background of teaching people to cook, people often think, well, you must have done it perfectly. You must have 3 really good cooks in your household, or they don't live here anymore. But yeah, I do not. I have my older daughter who is 23, living on her own in Manhattan, and has very limited skills in the kitchen because she did not care. She doesn't also is not the person who really like loves food, and she's eating to survive. She eats to live. She doesn't live to eat, that type of person.
Mhm.
So for her it's just not important, and she's got some basic skills and she has her go-to things, and that's all she has. And then I have my middle child who is 21 and loves to cook and loves to bake, and he just that's he and I connect a lot on that level, where I don't have that with
Mhm.
my older daughter. And then my younger one is kind of getting into it a little bit more and really starting to shine. And she's got her go-to meal, which I love what it is because it's actually my first meal that I cook with my mother, and it's chicken cutlets. And
Oh,
so when I was little, I grew up in a household of Jewish mother and Italian grandmother. So my dad's mom and my mom, my own mom, they both were enjoying cooking. And my mother gravitated more towards cooking Italian type of food anyway, because she perceived her mother to not be a good cook. So
got
she
it.
made a mean chicken soup, but everything else was just kind of just, it was there because you needed to eat. Um, and so she really enjoyed what she was exploring with my grandmother. And so I don't even know how old I was when I first started cooking with my mother. And my job was to bread the chicken cutlets because it's safer to do that than to fry, right? Frying is, you get the hot oil, you've got the hot burners. And so I would say choose a task in the kitchen that can be fun. Like, kind of kids like getting their hands dirty as much as a parent. That's stressful. I think if you can let go of like cleanliness and perfection and just let the kids play, um, you know, breading chicken cutlets is not much different from like, playing with Play-Doh, playing in the
Mhm,
sandbox, like that kind of thing.
mhm.
Yeah, there's chicken and there's cross contamination, all those things that you want to make sure everybody's washing their hands and they're not touching everything else in your kitchen. But just try and relax and let them do something that they perceive as fun, and that's getting them in the kitchen with you.
Well, and can I add a thought on that?
Yes.
I've definitely heard from families who are like, "Oh, my kids make such a mess in the kitchen. It's just such a disaster to clean up, blah, blah, blah."
Yeah.
And I think that's kinda what you were talking about, right? Like,
Yeah.
let go of the quote unquote cleanliness. Yes, hygiene and, like, safety have to remain important, right? But, like, who
Yeah.
cares if there's tomato sauce splattered all over the place? Like, whatever. But one of the things that I like to think about, and again, full disclosure, I don't have children of my own, so I get that I haven't been in the kitchen where the kid just took the 5-pound bag of flour and threw it everywhere,
I got a
right?
little anxiety, like, you mentioned this tomato sauce, now you're mentioning the flour. I am literally having, like, a physical anxiety response to that. I'm like, "Ugh."
Well, and I'm sure you're not alone in that, right? I'm sure you're not alone. But one of the things that I like to think about, or that I've offered to families when they're in that, like, oh my gosh, this is driving me out of my mind space, like, acknowledge that it's driving you out of your mind. But what I like to think is this situation going to matter in 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 days, 5 weeks, 5 months, or 5 years? And if the fact is that it's not like life altering, like, okay, yes, your 4 year old is going to need to learn to clean up the flour. Your 4 year old is going to need to learn to not throw the flour in the first place. I get that,
Mhm.
but they're
Mhm.
4. Now, 14 different conversation, right? But like if we're looking at it from that connection, right? Like you remember the first meal that you made with your mother. You don't
Mhm.
remember whether you threw tomato sauce or the flour everywhere else, but that's a
Nope.
memory. And so, like, for the families who are in that space, Debbie, where you are right now, of like the heart palpitations of living, right? Think about, okay, it's not just the, oh my goodness, my kitchen is a disaster, which it may well be, but also think about the experiences and the memories that we're creating and that connection, which I know we're getting to. But the 5 minutes to 5 years idea can be a tactical in the moment, help you like come back from the edge tool.
Yeah. No, I completely agree, and unless you are responding in a negative way, your child's only gonna remember the fun that they had and the time they spent with you, because what's the alternative? If you're cooking dinner and you don't let your kid into the kitchen, what are they doing? Maybe they're in front of the TV and you have your time to do it,
Hmm.
or maybe they're not in front of the TV and they're doing an activity, then therefore you are kind of disjointed and you're cooking, but you're paying attention to them, and then you have to stop cooking and go help them. So maybe that extra time it takes you to cook is the same amount of extra time it would take you to go back and forth to their activity
Oh,
in the
that's a really good
kitchen,
point.
right?
Yeah.
And so when you
Okay.
think it's taking longer in the kitchen, unless they're being cared for by somebody else and they're interacting with
Mhm.
that person, or they're not and they're parked in front of a TV, you're
Sure.
gonna have to spend your time going through double time, like cooking and then activity back and forth. So
Yep. Yep.
still gonna take you as long to cook.
Right. All right, so we've talked about some of the how, make it fun, give them tasks or give them almost like sous chef, prep chef type
Give them a
things when they're
task.
younger,
I have
right?
a few other things. Let's not let go of helping them get involved in decision making. That empowers them to start thinking about what they want to eat. And so
Mhm,
maybe not a 4-year-old so much, but as they get a little bit older, and let them pick that one meal a week that they've chosen, and then that's the meal. Maybe they're not helping on every single one. I'm not saying you need to have your kid in the kitchen for every single meal that you're cooking. It's really nice if you could do that, but maybe it's just one a week, and that
mhm,
meal is chosen by that child, and if you have multiple children, maybe there's one meal that each of them picks, and then that's the meal that they get to help with, and then that's their special time with mom or dad or whoever's making the meal.
mhm.
So, yeah, allowing them to choose will help. I think it also helps with picky eating because they've
Mm,
kind of invested in it from the very beginning.
sure.
Yeah.
All right, awesome. I'm trying to think back, like, I don't have many memories of cooking I remember, like, holiday type stuff. But the
Mhm.
one thing I remember from my childhood was my mom always made soup, and it was literally, we called it kitchen sink soup because we never knew what it was gonna be. It was like everything but the kitchen sink, and, like, she'd start it at the beginning of the week, and she would just add to it, like, we'd have one big stock pot, and then it would just, as it diminished, she'd throw more things into it, and when it was something that was particularly savory, I'd be like, "Hey, mom, can you make this again?" And she'd be like, "Nope," because it was literally never the same twice.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
So,
Yeah,
right, so letting them
very interesting.
choose,
Yeah.
giving them tasks, other ways to
Mhm.
invite them in.
Um, let's stick with those. It's because none of this is very easy, right? It could be a little bit of a challenge to or hurdles. Like I'm saying all of these things, yet these are very hard to put into practice.
Okay.
So, I have great ideas, but did I do it with my children? Not necessarily.
Well, but just because you didn't doesn't mean that others can't. I'm thinking of a friend of
Mhm,
mine who has a little, like a little, and she posts TikToks regularly of, help having him, with his hands in the bread dough or something like that, right? So she's
mhm,
setting that foundation of him being involved in the kitchen very, very early, all the
yep,
way up to another really close friend of mine has a 14-year-old who regularly cooks 2 to 3 meals a week because he enjoys cooking. It was something that he and his father shared. Unfortunately, his father passed away, but that's just something that was a memory that he now has with his dad. And,
mhm,
he will go in, and even the younger kiddo, not that didn't have the same relationship with cooking with dad, but sees his older brother cooking and he's like, okay, I can figure things out, and it's,
mhm,
my friend is like, I am not raising young men who cannot cook for themselves. Like, just end of story. Plus, she's like, I'm a solo mom. Like, she didn't even have the co-parent in that situation where she was just like, my kids need to learn how to fend for themselves. I am not their
yeah,
everything. I'm not their maid. I'm not their laundry person. I'm not their caretaker.
yeah,
I can't be. And so,
right.
kind of out of necessity, but also out of just, prior experience, they're developing into capable cooks.
Yeah, and you can make it also a little bit kitschy for the kid, right? You get them their own tools, especially knives, like, if you wanna get them cutting, get kitchen kid-safe knives, and then maybe they have their own apron, and they make the little cute little sets, like a little chef hat and an apron, like, kids get excited for that stuff, and then it's not just the pretend kitchen, it's the real kitchen, and they can really, really help.
I never even thought about that. I didn't know, like, kid safe knives were a thing.
They are. Yeah, because like, you don't wanna give a kid a real knife, I mean, you never know what they're gonna
Yeah.
do with it, right?
You don't wanna give me a real knife, let's be honest.
So, yeah, they make kid-safe knives where you can let them just kinda cut things, and have fun with it. And maybe they're fully helping with the task that you're involved in, or maybe they're doing their own little setup on the
Mhm.
side while you're cooking, and they feel
Okay.
like they're involved.
So, I can look at this with a background in education and go, getting kids in the kitchen has so many benefits. Number one, getting them to follow step by step processes with, especially like if you've got kids with ADHD or attention challenges, step by step processes are hard. Like, our brains
Mhm,
just, as somebody with ADHD, our brains just don't work that way all the time. Like, step by step is really hard sometimes.
mhm,
And so there's planning involved, there's going step by step, there's thinking ahead. Like, how do you, one of the things that I still struggle with is if I'm making multiple meals, or not multiple meals, multiple dishes, and I want them
yeah,
all out at the same time.
yeah,
Like, that
yeah,
is just because I can look, yeah, it tells me suggested, prep time versus cook time.
yep.
And then there's me.
No,
Like, we
it's
need to
not just
factor
you,
in the,
don't, this is one of
so
the
like,
hugest things I teach in my classes. Never, ever trust the time, and then don't assume it's you who have failed because you didn't meet the time.
right.
Yes.
So, like, how do we bring that in? Like, what are some of the other benefits? Obviously, there's the connection because it's opportunity. Again, anytime we can be side by side with somebody as opposed to face, right? Face to face is very confrontational. And this comes
Mhm.
up in a lot of the conversations with guests that we have because I hear so many parents saying, the maybe old school, at least this was my experience, you look at me when I'm talking to you idea, right?
Yeah.
Which is face to face. What did you do? What were you thinking? And it becomes very adversarial, which doesn't
Mhm.
help the relationship. Not saying there's not a place for that, depending in the dynamic, but having an opportunity to be side by side psychologically develops more of like an us versus the world mentality, and it helps the kids feel safer. There's the step-by-step processing, there's the learning to read, there's the math aspects of things, like learning to measure things. To your point from our earlier conversation, if we're doubling a recipe, there's fractions and multipliers and things like that. What
Mhm.
are some of
Mhm.
the other things that you see, in the classes that you teach? I know you've talked about, like, you do couples classes, or when you have folks go on your retreats, what are some of the other benefits? And or like you talked about your son, you and he are more the have the foodie bond, if you will,
Mhm, mhm.
together. How do like, what are some of the other things that are benefits that folks may not recognize about getting their kids in the kitchen?
Well, I mean, the connection is probably the hugest one. Side-by-side activities also foster conversation, right?
Mhm.
So, those conversations that you wanna have at the dinner table, they're not confrontational, but you are literally staring at your child going, "How was your day?" And they're like, "Good." That's what you get.
Right.
Versus, like, they're in a task, right? They're not really focused on the task as much as or the conversation as they are the task. So,
Mhm.
that how was your day? Like, who'd you eat lunch with? Whatever those conversations you wanna draw out of a kid, you're
Mhm.
not getting that at the dinner table as much as you might get when they're, like, just doing something and
Right.
yeah,
Well, and that's
things
even
might
assuming
come
that we're
out.
sitting at a dinner table in the first place, because I'm sure there are many families who veg out in front of the couch and watch TV while they eat dinner, which is a different conversation, right?
Different conversation, yes. Yes. No judgment, but dinner time is a great time to bond. If you're not
Yeah,
happy,
abs
especially if your kid's not in the kitchen, it's a great time to bond, but totally
sure.
other conversation. There's a health benefit to having a kid in the kitchen, helping out, knowing what's in their food, knowing what's on their plate, knowing where food comes from. Like, if you get them involved in the whole process, they will learn early on that, it's really important to know what's in your food. So, are
Mhm.
you making everything from, whole food components? Doing that versus using all processed and all prepackaged food items is going to make a big difference in terms of them knowing kind of what is, I'm going to put air quotes here, healthy and what's not, because
Sure.
you can find prepackaged, prepared food items that are still gonna be healthy-ish, compared to what you're gonna make, and also, you can make a very unhealthy dish with whole
Yeah, you
foods
could.
by
Mhm.
adding a lot of other things to it. So, but the biggest thing about cooking for yourself versus, this is a different topic, but ordering out, which is why I
Mhm.
teach healthy cooking, is
Mhm.
knowing what's in your food is the first step of eating
Right.
healthier.
Right.
And so there's the health component, and it's a lifelong lesson,
Mhm.
that if taught early on is very helpful. Um, I tried to get my kids to join me at my, CSA, which is a community supported agriculture share at a farm. So you go and sometimes you just pick up a basket of ingredients of vegetables, and then other farms, you go and you pick up some things, but then you also go into the field and you harvest yourself.
Oh,
And I
cool.
thought early on that having my kids go and see where food actually comes from, that it doesn't actually necessarily come from the supermarket, would
Right.
be a great way for educating them. And it kind of backfired because my oldest is afraid of bees. So we didn't spend a lot of time at the farm after the first few times. I
Right.
still, 20 years later, am going to the farm to pick up my vegetables, but getting them involved in any way. So maybe they're going to the supermarket with you and they're just looking and smelling, and does a dish that you create center around an item they find in the produce section?
Mm,
Maybe.
mhm.
There's plenty of ways to find dishes to make with X ingredient online.
Sure.
So
Sure.
you can do it that way. You can back into it that way, but having them involved in different steps is definitely the key to success later on in life.
Awesome. And that actually is a good lead in, given that February, one of our themes this month was healthy eating and nutrition. We actually are going to be having a conversation later this week with a registered dietitian who is going to be talking about how we talk about food as adults and how that influences kids, as well as talking about some disordered eating patterns and how social media plays into that. So definitely complements to what we're talking about here. So for anyone tuning in, make sure that you check those out with Samantha Berkowitz. But Debbie, I am super excited. Can you share your website and Instagram again for folks who are tuning in case they missed it in our other conversation?
Of course. So my business is The Effortless Kitchen. So website is theeffortlesskitchen.com. Easy to
Mhm.
find. Just don't forget the THE at the beginning. And Instagram handle is The Effortless Kitchen by Debbie. And on there, on Instagram especially, I share a lot of food photos from my classes, from my travels. I do travel photos as well from my retreats. So all sorts of fun stuff to see on there.
Awesome. Debbie, thank you. I know I've learned
Thank
some good
you.
stuff today, and I know that folks who tune in will also. So appreciate your time, appreciate your knowledge, and appreciate your support of everything that we're building at Parent Tween Village.
Thank you. Thank you so
Have a
much.
great one. Have a great one, everybody.
Bye.